In the shadows of marble villas and crowded marketplaces, there lived thousands of boys whose names were never written down. They swept floors, carried letters, smiled on command, and disappeared into history as if they'd never existed. This is not a story of gladiators or emperors. It's the forgotten childhoods of Roman boy slaves, born into silence, sold like objects, trained to vanish behind polished bronze and silk-draped halls. What did it mean to grow up as property in a world that praised discipline over dignity? Behind every feast and every statue was a child expected never to speak. This is their story, uncovered from what little was left behind. Born into chains, the life of a slave child in Rome. In ancient Rome, a child's fate could be sealed before their first breath. For those born into slavery, vernae, as they were called, freedom was not a lost future, but a concept never known. These children were not kidnapped or conquered. They were born on Roman soil, in Roman households to enslaved parents. Roman law treated the child of a slave mother as property of the master, regardless of the father's status. A boy born in a senator's villa to an enslaved woman would not inherit anything from the man who fathered him, only the legal title of slave. Slave children were not rare. Estimates suggest that in the late Republic and early Empire, as much as 30–40% of the population in Italy may have been enslaved. Within this group, births among enslaved people were encouraged. A master who owned fertile enslaved women could increase his holdings naturally, without purchasing new slaves. For elite households, it was often cheaper to raise a boy from birth to obedience than to break one newly purchased. These boys grew up inside walled villas and urban insulae, seeing the world only as it existed under the authority of their owner. The upbringing of enslaved boys varied depending on the household. Some were given tasks as early as 5 or 6, fetching, cleaning, serving meals. They were taught to avoid eye contact with free Romans and to anticipate commands before they were spoken. Praise was rare. Correction was constant. In the best of homes, this meant cold indifference. In others, it meant casual violence. A boy who hesitated could be slapped, whipped, or made to kneel for hours. There was no legal age of consent, no protected childhood. Roman society did not see children, especially enslaved ones, as beings in need of shelter. They were seen as incomplete adults, destined to serve, labor, or die. Philosopher Seneca once wrote that a slave should never laugh in front of his master. What he left unsaid was that a boy might be punished even for smiling at the wrong moment. Trust, in these settings, was a dangerous emotion. Slave boys rarely kept their birth names. A Greek child might be renamed Felix, meaning lucky, or Eros, the god of love. Names became labels of usefulness or mockery. This renaming served not only to erase prior identity, but to remind the child who had the right to define them. Sometimes, boys were simply called by numbers: tertius for third, quartus for fourth. These names could be passed from one slave to another when one died, without sentiment or ceremony. Literacy was rare, but occasionally given to boys intended for domestic or clerical service. In elite households, slave boys might be trained as scribes or copyists if they showed aptitude. They could learn to read and write Latin or Greek while transcribing their master's correspondence. But this education was not liberation, it was specialization. A literate slave was simply more valuable. Outside elite homes, life for slave boys in rural estates and mines was brutal from the start. Children might be yoked to plows or made to carry heavy loads. Agricultural manuals even described how to control child slaves through diet and punishment. In such environments, survival was uncertain. Many never reached adulthood. Despite the cruelty of their world, some enslaved boys formed bonds with siblings, with other children in the household, even with sympathetic adults. A shared crust of bread, a whispered joke in the shadows, or a glance of silent solidarity could offer brief comfort. But even friendship came with risk. If one child was punished or sold, The bond ended without warning. Attachments were temporary, by design. By the time an enslaved boy reached his teens, his role was often set. He was no longer a child in the household's eyes, but a functional asset. His worth was measured in labor, appearance, obedience, or resale value. There were no birthdays, no rites of passage, no record of dreams, only the gradual erasure of boyhood in service to someone else's comfort. This was the beginning for many in Rome, not a life interrupted, but a life designed to be forgotten. Markets and merchants, the business of buying boys. In Roman cities, the sale of enslaved boys was not hidden or whispered about. It was a public industry woven into daily life. Markets specializing in slaves venalia servorum operated in broad daylight, often in the heart of busy towns. Rome had its own prominent slave markets, including one near the Forum and another on the Esquiline Hill. Here, human lives were traded alongside spices, grain, and livestock. Buyers could inspect, question, and haggle, and for boys especially, appearance mattered. Traders knew what attracted Roman buyers. Pale skin, soft features, and signs of Greek or Eastern origin often increased a boy's value, particularly for domestic or personal service. Youth was prized, but so was obedience. A boy who flinched or looked away might be marked down in price. To mask flaws, traders used oil, cosmetics, or verbal trickery. They might claim a boy was younger than he was, or exaggerate his fluency in Latin. If a child had been sick or mistreated, they dressed him to hide bruises or scars. Buyers came with different needs. A wealthy matron might want a quiet boy to fan her during meals or carry letters. A merchant might look for a fast-footed child for errands. Others came with darker intentions, seeking boys for concubinage, for pleasure, or as a display of power. Roman law did not restrict these uses. The boy was a commodity. His future belonged to the buyer. Auction blocks were common in large markets. Boys were placed on raised platforms, often naked, or barely clothed, so buyers could inspect their bodies. Their teeth, limbs, and posture were examined like livestock. A tablet around their neck listed basic details: age, origin, and any notable traits. Some listings came with guarantees: healthy, Greek-speaking, docile. If a boy turned out to be sick or rebellious, the buyer could return him within 30 days for illness, 6 months for behavior. Children born into slavery were often sold at a discount, unless they came from a skilled lineage. But imported boys, especially those captured in war or acquired through piracy, cost more. They came from places Rome viewed as exotic: Syria, Thrace, Egypt, and beyond. Traders emphasized this foreignness, playing into Roman fascination with the unfamiliar. Greek boys, in particular, were seen as refined and well-suited for cultured households. A captured child might be separated from his siblings upon arrival and placed in a pen waiting to be cataloged and priced. Slave dealers made fortunes from this system. The most successful merchants operated networks of agents who traveled with armies or sailed trade routes, acquiring children where opportunities arose. In Sicily, Gaul, and Asia Minor, local collaborators captured or bred enslaved children, sending them by sea or caravan to Rome. These dealers were not shady figures in alleys. They were businessmen with ledgers and contracts. Some even sold directly to the imperial palace. Prices varied based on a boy's perceived use. A child destined for field labor might cost less than a good cloak, but a handsome, educated, or exotic boy could rival the price of fine furniture or a horse. In rare cases, prices appear in surviving records. One bill of sale from Egypt lists a boy sold for 200 drachmas. Another, from Pompeii, notes a boy with singing talent sold for nearly double that. These numbers reveal how Roman society measured worth by function, not humanity. Not all boys went straight to final owners. Some were held in stock, rotated through markets, or rented temporarily to households. In the meantime, they lived in holding cells or crowded dormitories. Hygiene was minimal, food was basic, boys who disobeyed were beaten. Those who didn't sell quickly might be reclassified as laborers, field hands, or worse. For many, this period was the most disorienting, having no master but no freedom, just waiting to be chosen. Boys were transferred to new households under contract, often carrying a wax tablet listing their sale. Ownership changed hands with the same formality as any commodity. The boy simply followed household servants or household property. In the homes of Rome's elite, boy slaves moved through spaces without being seen. They opened doors before knocks landed, poured wine before it was requested, folded linens without being told. Their presence was constant, yet they remained on the edge of recognition. In senatorial villas and equestrian estates, each boy had a specific role dictated by household rank and routine. Some were responsible for preparing the master's clothing each morning, laying out robes, belts, and sandals in a fixed order. Others assisted with shaving, held mirrors, or applied scented oils before public outings. In the women's quarters, boys handled perfumes, delivered messages, or arranged hair tools. Tasks were precise and performed under supervision. Repetition was the method. Mistakes were not easily forgotten. Labor followed a strict internal hierarchy. A boy assigned to sweep the floors would never serve in the dining room. One who poured wine did not care for the garden. The most trusted boys, such as cubicularii, personal attendants within the bedroom, were chosen for their obedience and ability to endure silence. These boys performed duties in the most private spaces, often under direct scrutiny. Their mistakes were corrected immediately and visibly. Despite their physical closeness to the family, slave boys were not seen as part of the household in any human sense. They were legal property, listed in inventories beside items like dishes and chairs. A boy might be recorded as one Cappadocian boy, age 10, untrained. He could be sold, exchanged, or given away at will. Even after years of service, a change in ownership required no explanation. Their sleeping arrangements reinforced this detachment. Some slept in storage rooms, under staircases, or at the foot of their master's bed. Bedding, if provided, was thin. Meals came only after the household had eaten. There were no private spaces, no allowances for rest beyond the completion of duties. Clothing consisted of coarse wool tunics, sometimes marked with dyes to indicate household role. Appearance was regulated. Comfort was irrelevant. The line between servant and object was rarely acknowledged. A boy who responded before being called might be praised, but not remembered. One who moved too loudly might be struck. In wealthier homes, certain boys were chosen for display. Greek or Eastern boys with pale skin were dressed in matched garments or given jewelry when accompanying their mistresses in public. These visual details served the prestige of the owner, not the dignity of the child. Discipline was central to their lives. Punishments were delivered to preserve authority. Whippings were standard, but other punishments, food denial, sleep disruption, or silent confinement, were also common. Correction was not about reform. It was about maintaining function. The boy was expected to operate like any other tool in the household. Roman law set no boundaries on how a master could treat a slave. Resistance to an order was not treated as rebellion, but as evidence of deficiency. Writers like Cato the Elder recommended strict discipline and warned against kindness. The more skilled the boy, the more tightly his behavior was controlled. Mercy was never guaranteed. Some boys were trained in superficial charm. They learned to greet guests with prepared phrases, smile on command, and anticipate gestures. But these behaviors were not signs of wellness. They were protective measures. A cheerful response might earn a moment's reprieve. A clever joke might secure a better task. Everything was transactional. To outsiders, a quiet, attentive boy suggested order and refinement. To the family, his reliability was a sign of status. But for the boy, life was constant adjustment to others' expectations. Every gesture, every movement was watched At times, small connections formed between slave boys, shared glances during work, a piece of bread passed behind a curtain. These moments were fragile and discouraged. Any sign of emotional closeness could be seen as a threat to discipline, and separation followed swiftly. Attachment was a liability. To live as a boy slave in a Roman household was to be present without being counted. Work was expected without instruction. Emotions were risks. Silence was safety. A boy could spend years in a room and never be asked what he thought. He was not a member of the family. He was part of the furniture. Pleasure and power, exploitation in the private sphere. In ancient Rome, the legal distinction between person and property dissolved completely for enslaved boys, particularly in the realm of private pleasure. Roman law granted masters nearly unlimited control over their slaves, including their bodies. For boys within elite households, this control often included sexual exploitation, normalized by custom, tolerated by law, and rarely questioned. There were no protective regulations. No concept of consent existed for the enslaved. A boy's resistance, if offered, was not considered defiance. It was treated as an interruption to the master's rights. Roman jurists did not concern themselves with what a slave wanted. The law, from the 12 tables onward, emphasized ownership. Masters could use or abuse their slaves in any way, short of arbitrary killing in later periods. For boy slaves, this meant that exploitation could begin at any age and take many forms. Some boys were singled out early for physical traits: youthful appearance, light skin, curly hair, or delicate features. These children were groomed for proximity to their owners, often under the guise of service. A boy assigned to bathe his master, dress him, or serve in the bedroom might be chosen not only for obedience, but for appeal. Terms like pour delicatus appear in literary sources meaning chosen boy, often implying a favored slave kept for personal pleasure. These boys might receive better clothing, lighter duties, or even gifts, but none of this indicated affection. Such treatment was transactional. Their appearance and compliance elevated their function, not their status. The line between privilege and exploitation was thin and always determined by the master. Writers of the period often reference these dynamics without condemnation. Martial, Juvenal, and Petronius include boy slaves in their satirical portraits of Roman decadence. In these texts, sexual use of boys is not the subject of critique. It is the norm that forms the background for other moral observations. Even among philosophers and lawmakers, there was little interest in curbing the exploitation of enslaved children. In wealthier homes, some boys were raised specifically to entertain. These children were trained to dance, sing, or recite poetry at private banquets. Applause was rare. Laughter at their expense was common. A boy who made a mistake might be mocked or struck. In other cases, the line between performance and availability blurred. Guests could request a slave boy by name, and their requests were often honored. The lupanar, or brothel, also included boys among its offerings. In certain districts of Rome, enslaved children were used for commercial sex work. In Pompeii, graffiti and surviving price lists show the sale of access to both girls and boys, often with prices varying by perceived desirability. These places were legal, taxed, and considered a normal part of Roman urban life. Boys in such settings had no autonomy. They were often marked or tattooed to prevent escape and subjected to repeated abuse. Documentation of these practices appears in legal texts, satirical poems, and commentaries by Stoic philosophers, though rarely in a way that suggests reform. The Roman worldview did not place moral limits on a master's pleasure. The idea that a boy slave might suffer psychological harm was never considered. The focus remained on the rights of the owner and the management of property. For the boys, daily life meant anticipating touch, enduring inspection, and navigating the unpredictable desires of those who controlled them. Their value was measured by youthfulness, docility, and physical appeal. A change in ownership could mean reassignment to labor or reclassification into new forms of exploitation. Occasionally, a boy might be elevated to a semi-public role as a companion. These children were displayed in public settings, accompanying their masters to baths, gardens, or festivals. Their behavior was closely managed. A misstep in tone or gaze could result in swift punishment. Even favored boys remained vulnerable. They could be discarded, sold, or replaced without explanation. Some enslaved boys learned to survive by staying compliant reading moods, avoiding conflict, and masking fear. Others became silent, withdrawn, responding only when required. Emotional detachment offered no protection. In elite Roman homes, pleasure and power were inseparable. These boys served not just in labor, but at the whim of desire. Body as tool. Castration in eunuchs in Roman society. In Roman society, the body of a slave boy was not protected. It was shaped, punished, or altered to meet the desires of the elite. Among the most extreme expressions of this control was castration. Though not common across all of Rome, the practice was known, recorded, and in some cases, commercialized. Removing a boy's ability to reproduce was less about suppressing desire and more about converting a person into a specialized tool. Castration served particular roles. Eunuchs castrated males were often preferred in situations demanding obedience, emotional distance, or access to private spaces. They might serve in women's quarters, act as attendants, or function as symbols of control. A eunuch was expected to lack both ambition and lust. His altered condition was a kind of insurance against rebellion, real or imagined. Roman writers responded to eunuchs with discomfort or curiosity. In medical and legal texts, eunuchs were classified into types, some born that way, some altered by illness, and others changed through surgery. The third group, boys castrated by human hands, were viewed as manufactured. Their fate was usually determined by the demands of a household, a trade, or a religion. The practice itself was foreign to early Roman tradition. But as the empire expanded, it absorbed customs from the eastern provinces. Traders imported eunuchs from places like Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor. These children were often altered before puberty. Earlier castration increased the chances of preserving certain traits that were later seen as desirable height, smooth skin, high voice. It was not science. It was preference, tied to control and appearance. The procedure was brutal. Descriptions vary, but some methods involved removing only the testicles. Others, the entire external genitalia. There was no anesthesia. Tools were crude. Bleeding, infection, and death were frequent. Those who survived were often considered more valuable. Their bodies were seen as refined through suffering. When castration was successful, the boy's physical traits made him a rare possession. He might be kept indoors, dressed in fine fabrics, and trained in music or poetry. His body became both functional and decorative, part servant, part ornament. He did not belong to himself. He was property, redefined by mutilation. Some eunuchs joined religious cults. The Galli, priests of the goddess Magna Mater, were self-castrated and lived outside typical gender roles. Their ceremonies included dancing, music, and ritual frenzy. They disturbed traditional Roman ideas of masculinity. Tolerated but never fully accepted, they existed on the fringe of sanctioned life. In elite homes, eunuchs might oversee other slaves or serve as personal attendants to wealthy women. Their altered state gave them access denied to intact males, but this access did not mean freedom. It only confirmed their status as safe, compliant tools. In rare cases, especially in imperial courts, eunuchs gained influence. Most did not. Their futures were limited by their bodies. The practice was not without criticism. Some philosophers condemned castration, not because it was cruel, but because it was unnatural. Legal scholars debated whether eunuchs could marry, own property, or serve in the military. These questions often remained unresolved. Eunuchs fell outside typical categories. They were used where convenient, ignored where inconvenient. Their lives were mostly unrecorded. Few eunuchs left behind names or voices. Most appear in inventories or transaction logs. a singing boy priced higher than others, or a note about a quiet attendant. Occasionally, they show up in passing references at dinner parties or in court proceedings. Even then, they remain shadowy, known by role, not by story. To castrate a child was to assert complete control, not just over labor, but over identity. The act removed choice, imposed silence, and locked the boy's body into a role defined by others. There was no path back, no restoration. In the eyes of Roman owners, it was a transformation turning a boy into something rare, manageable, and useful. This was not done for health or safety. It was done for status, performance, or personal taste. The blade was not a tool of medicine, but of ownership. And in the logic of Roman slavery, altering the body was just another way of showing who had the right to decide what a life could become. The pedagogues. Educated slaves. Enslaved educators. In the homes of Rome's elite, education was both a symbol of status and a mechanism of control. Wealthy families did not send their sons out to learn from strangers. Instead, they brought the teachers into their homes, and many of those teachers were slaves. Known as pedagogi, these enslaved tutors were often Greek boys or young men taken during wars or purchased for their literacy, memory, and poise. A pedagogus lived with the child he was assigned to instruct. He accompanied him to formal lessons, monitored behavior, and corrected speech or posture. He carried writing tablets, prepared lesson materials, and ensured discipline was maintained during study. But even as he shaped the mind of a Roman citizen, he remained property. He might correct a boy's grammar in the morning and be beaten by the boy's father in the afternoon. His knowledge had value, but not his freedom. Many of these educators came from formerly noble or scholarly families in conquered regions. A captured Greek youth trained in Homer or Plato might find himself serving the child of a Roman general. He was expected to teach with precision, but remain deferential. His tone was monitored, his posture inspected, and his presence tolerated, never honored. His scholarship, once a mark of personal dignity, became a feature of his commercial price. The line between student and master was never equal. A Roman boy could be arrogant, dismissive, or even cruel. The enslaved educator was not permitted to raise his voice or assert authority. Discipline came through fear, not mutual respect. A minor mistake in recitation could earn the tutor a strike from the child or a public reprimand from the family. Even when a personal bond formed, it existed under fixed inequality. Affection was expected to flow upward, never in both directions. Gratitude, when it occurred, was more incidental than intentional. Living quarters for pedagogy varied depending on household rank and wealth. Some were placed in small annexes near the boys' rooms to ensure constant availability. Others slept among domestic staff. They rose before dawn and remained alert long after lessons ended. They were expected to be calm, present, and composed at all times, without regard for rest or personal needs. Meals, if shared with the family, were eaten in silence. More often, they dined after the household had finished, returning to their tasks without break. Beyond basic literacy, a pedagogus might teach rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and moral instruction. Ironically, while training Roman boys in abstract virtues like justice, courage, and temperance, the tutor himself lived without rights. He could be punished, reassigned, sold, or humiliated at any moment. Yet his intellectual influence was undeniable. Many Roman leaders were first taught by men they never came to respect, but whose knowledge fundamentally shaped their early minds. Some tutors were older, experienced, and quietly respected for their wisdom. But intellectual status did not ensure protection. A shift in household fortune could lead to sale or transfer. A child's lie or whim could bring lashes. Roman law offered no safeguards for enslaved teachers. Their intellect was seen as a resource, valuable only so long as it served its purpose. Occasionally, a gifted pedagogus was granted manumission. A former slave might go on to open a private school or serve as an independent tutor. But such cases were rare. Most lived and died in quiet service, their expertise buried with them. They left behind no scrolls of their own, only echoes of their instruction, passed down through the voices of Roman boys who became men. The Roman elite celebrated their sons' polish and fluency. A youth who could quote Virgil, debate Stoic ethics, or speak refined Greek was admired at banquets and in public life. But few inquired who taught him, or under what circumstances. The eloquence of a Roman nobleman often rested on the silent labor of the slave beside him. In Roman society, education reinforced hierarchy, not freedom. The pedagogus taught grammar and submission, preparing boys to rule while remaining enslaved. No monuments honored them. Their legacy lives only through the minds they shaped. In a culture that praised intellect but erased its enslaved sources, the pedagogus was a silent architect of Roman identity, denied his own future. Discipline without limits, punishment and fear. In ancient Rome, discipline was not a private matter or a moment of correction. It was a constant, visible assertion of ownership. For enslaved boys, punishment was not tied to justice, but to control. It reminded everyone, including the boy himself, of his place. Whether in public or behind household walls, Roman slavery functioned through fear, and discipline was its language. Punishment began early. A boy might be whipped for moving too slowly, mispronouncing a word, or spilling oil. There was no expectation of fairness. The whip was a tool of routine, not of emergency. Correction was loud and painful, but rarely questioned. In many homes, beatings occurred daily. Sometimes it was the master who punished. Other times it was a senior slave, ordered to enforce obedience. The chain of command included pain. The instruments varied. Rods, leather straps, and wooden paddles were common. Some households kept scourges tipped with bone or metal, designed to tear skin. A boy's age offered no protection. Young children were often punished more harshly, on the theory that early correction ensured lifelong obedience. Bruises, welts, and open wounds were not signs of cruelty, but of discipline. Visible evidence of control. Roman law gave masters nearly unchecked authority over slaves. A slave owner could beat, starve, brand, or even kill without legal consequence. Philosophers like Seneca or Pliny occasionally warned against extreme violence, but their concerns centered on the owner's image, not the slave's suffering. A master who lost his temper too easily was said to lack restraint, not compassion. Enslaved boys learned to read their surroundings. They monitored voices, footsteps, glances. Silence was safer than speech. Eye contact might be seen as insolence. Delay could be punished as defiance. Boys learned to stay alert, emotionless, fast, but quiet. This wasn't training, it was survival. A boy who cried might be mocked. One who hesitated might be tied to a post and whipped in front of others. Public punishment served a purpose. It reinforced the hierarchy. At markets, slave auctions sometimes featured boys who had been recently beaten to demonstrate that they were broken in. On large estates, overseers beat one boy to instruct many. A wounded body was a message, one that didn't need to be spoken. Punishment extended beyond the physical. Sleep was withheld. Tasks were repeated endlessly. Food might be spoiled or denied. In cold weather, boys could be sent outside, unclothed. These were not accidents, but choices, methods of showing control over comfort, time, and need. Some punishments focused on humiliation. A boy might be shaved in patches, forced to wear a placard naming his offense, or crawl through the house. In elite homes, punishments could be theatrical, performed in front of guests as signs of strict governance. Laughter sometimes accompanied the boy's shame. The more his dignity was erased, the more complete the master's power appeared. Fear shaped behavior in lasting ways. Some boys developed tremors or flinched at every movement. Others became still, blank, quiet. They moved deliberately, spoke only when spoken to, and avoided attention. The absence of bruises did not mean safety only, that fear had taken hold. A boy who required no beating to obey was considered ideal. No space was safe. Bedrooms, kitchens, and courtyards were all potential sites of punishment. Even the bathhouse, with its heat and water, could become a place of pain. A dropped dish, a late arrival, or a quiet mistake could lead to violence. The line between labor and punishment was often invisible. Resistance was dangerous. A boy who tried to run or strike back might be tortured, branded, or killed. Some harmed themselves to appear sick, hoping to delay their duties. Others collapsed from exhaustion. If a boy died from punishment or neglect, it was treated as the loss of property, not a person. Discipline in this world was not just physical. It was psychological. A boy was not trained like a pupil, but conditioned like an animal. His inner life shrank to a set of instincts: avoid, obey, endure. He moved through each day like a shadow noticed only when he failed. In Roman society, fear was not a defect in the system. It was the system, and the quiet obedience of enslaved boys was built on the constant threat of pain. Entertainment and sacrifice. Children in Roman spectacle. In Roman public life, spectacle was more than distraction. It was a statement of power over nature, enemies, animals, and people, and in some cases, over children. The empire turned cruelty into ceremony. Within that system, enslaved boys were sometimes placed not only in households and workshops, but in arenas and theaters, spaces where their suffering became part of the entertainment. The Roman appetite for public spectacle is well documented. Amphitheaters hosted combat, executions, reenactments, and mock battles. While adult gladiators drew the largest crowds, children were not excluded from these rituals. They appeared in mythological plays, mock naval battles, and in roles designed to shock or amuse. Their youth did not grant them protection. It heightened the effect. Literary sources occasionally reference child performers. Martial, the Roman poet, made mention of a young boy trained to recite poetry in the nude, his slight frame emphasizing his helplessness. Other sources describe boys dressed as animals, made to fight or run before being caught and slain as part of staged hunts. These events blurred the line between theater and execution. For the viewers, the presence of a child added novelty. For the child, it meant danger. The Veneciones staged wild beast hunts were especially brutal. Children, often enslaved, were sometimes sent into the arena alongside animals for display or death. While adult criminals and prisoners of war were common victims, boys could be used as expendable bodies to arouse the crowd or fill a spectacle's narrative. A child running from a lion was not a tragedy, it was a scene. In some festivals, children were part of processions. Boys in chains might be paraded as representations of conquered peoples. Others might be posed as divine figures, then punished to mock the gods they resembled. During the Saturnalia, a feast of inversion, slave boys might be elevated temporarily, given roles of mock authority, only to be humiliated or beaten after the festivities. Their participation was never on their own terms. Some children trained as entertainers rather than combatants. Roman households with means sometimes kept enslaved boys as acrobats, jugglers, or musicians. In elite circles, a well-trained child could perform at banquets, bending his body in painful positions or dancing in stylized ways that mimicked adult behavior. These displays were aesthetic and eroticized, designed to amuse but also to assert dominance over a pliable body. The Circus Maximus held chariot races that drew tens of thousands. While adult drivers dominated, some races involved smaller carts drawn by goats or ponies, driven by enslaved boys. These children were often injured in crashes. Their small size, no protection against wheels or hooves. No special accommodations were made. The race was for the crowd, not for the child. Beyond the arena, some children were used in religious performances that involved symbolic sacrifice. In certain mystery cults, the enactment of death and rebirth featured boys dressed as sacrificial victims. While these roles did not always lead to real harm, they reinforced the idea that a child's body was not sacred. It was symbolic, adaptable, and public. Real sacrifices involving children were rare in the imperial period, but Rome's early history includes troubling hints. The story of Marcus Curtius, who leapt into a chasm to save the city, and other legends involving youthful self-sacrifice, shaped Roman ideals about duty and the expendability of youth for the greater good. While these myths celebrated willing courage, they echoed in the empire's use of unwilling children in spectacle. Not all records are clear. In many cases, the boys who appeared in Roman entertainment go unnamed. They exist only as brief references. A boy was thrown to the beasts, or a slave child danced at the banquet. Their faces are missing from mosaics. Their voices did not survive, but their presence is undeniable. The crowd's role cannot be overlooked. Spectacle depended on witnesses. Children were punished, humiliated, or killed before audiences who clapped, laughed, or watched silently. Their suffering was not hidden. It was framed, lit by torchlight, and sanctioned by the state. Rome's cultural pride and civilization stood beside its readiness to consume the lives of the young. For the enslaved boy in spectacle, there was no afterward-only display. His body and fear were consumed by the crowd, his pain reduced to a fleeting moment of public amusement. Temples, shrines, and slaves of the gods. In ancient Rome, slavery extended beyond households and estates. It reached into the sacred. Temples, shrines, and cultic spaces relied on enslaved labor, and among these were boys assigned to serve the divine. They were not priests. They were property offered, inherited, or purchased for the benefit of the gods and their keepers. The great temples of Rome, those of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, Vesta, and Mars, Ultor, were not simply places of worship. They were administrative and ritual centers, staffed and maintained by complex hierarchies. Among the most invisible members of that structure were the temple slaves, known sometimes as servi publici, or sacred slaves. They cleaned altars, prepared incense, carried ceremonial items, and stood silently as rituals were performed. Their tasks were menial, but their presence essential. Boy slaves in these roles were chosen for obedience, clarity of voice, and purity of appearance. Some were children of enslaved women owned by temple officials. Others were donated as religious offerings, a practice with deep precedent. A wealthy Roman might dedicate a boy to the gods in fulfillment of a vow or as a display of piety. Once accepted, the boy belonged not to a person, but to the cult. The Temple of Vesta, with its sacred fire tended by the Vestal virgins, employed young male slaves for manual duties the priestesses were forbidden to perform. These boys fetched water, chopped wood, and maintained the physical space of the sanctuary. Though close to sacred authority, they remained outside its protections. If one failed in his duty, he could be beaten. The gods did not shield him from earthly hierarchy. In other cults, enslaved boys played ceremonial roles. The worship of Isis, imported from Egypt, included processions where boy slaves marched with sacred objects, clothed in linen and adorned with amulets. In the rites of Bacchus, or Dionysus, boys sometimes appeared in dances or musical performances. Their youth and beauty became part of the religious aesthetic. But behind the symbolism was control. The performance was not voluntary. Some temples owned entire households of slaves. On larger temple estates, boys labored in agricultural fields, supporting the financial base of religious operations. Others served in urban temples, where they were trained to chant hymns, assist in sacrifices, or serve food at ritual feasts. They were considered living instruments, tools of worship and maintenance alike. There were no consistent rules for their treatment. In some temples, overseers enforced discipline with rods. In others, older slaves kept order, meting out punishment as needed. A boy might be considered sacred property, But this did not guarantee mercy. If he broke a vessel or disrupted a ritual, he might be flogged like any other. The sanctity of the space did not extend to his body. Roman legal texts record debates over the status of temple slaves. Were they the property of the state, the gods, the priests? These questions mattered when such slaves were sold, transferred, or punished. Some jurists concluded that while the gods could not own property in a legal sense, temples could act as institutions, allowing priests to manage the enslaved on the deity's behalf. The paradox was clear. A temple dedicated to mercy or purity might still own children subjected to harsh discipline. A shrine known for healing might keep boys whose daily lives involved cleaning blood from sacrificial stones. The divine was mediated through human structures, and in those structures, cruelty could be framed as ritual necessity. Occasionally, a temple slave gained favor. A boy with musical talent or pleasing manners might be spared from hard labor, used instead for ceremonies or honored guests. In rare instances, an aging temple slave was granted manumission freedom in old age as a token of long service. But most lived and died within sacred walls, their names unrecorded, their prayers unheard. For Roman society, the presence of enslaved boys in temples was unremarkable. The gods required service. That the service came from a child's hands was neither a contradiction nor a concern. Piety and power lived side by side, and devotion could be performed through domination. Even in silence, enslaved temple boys symbolized Roman control reaching even the divine. Their unseen hands sustained the altars, maintained the rituals, and ensured worship continued without pause or acknowledgement. Escape and betrayal, the cost of running away. In the Roman world, the enslaved boy who ran was not simply a fugitive. He was a threat to order, a challenge to ownership, and a target for punishment. Running away was never a minor offense. It was a direct confrontation with the structure of slavery itself. Whether driven by desperation, abuse, or the faint hope of freedom, escape carried brutal consequences. Enslaved children, especially boys, were vulnerable to flight not because they were rebellious, but because they were often alone. Many had been taken from distant provinces, separated from family, and passed between households. They lacked community, identity, or a sense of place. A boy assigned to errands outside the home might see an open road and consider vanishing. Some made the attempt. Few succeeded. Roman law was explicit about fugitive slaves. The lex fufia canina and other legal measures permitted owners to use any means necessary to recover and punish runaways. Notices were posted across cities, wax tablets nailed to public walls, listing the boy's name, appearance, and last known location. Rewards were offered. Sometimes, a slave was branded on the forehead with an F, for fugitivus, fugitive. The mark was permanent. Owners were encouraged to make examples of boys who ran. A first attempt might result in whipping or confinement. A second could mean mutilation, a broken leg, a missing ear. Some households chained boys at night to prevent escape. In rural estates, collars with inscribed warnings were locked around their necks, identifying them as property and warning others not to assist. But not all attempts failed. A few boys reached sympathetic households, border settlements, or religious sanctuaries. Roman records describe rare cases where escaped slaves were absorbed into other communities, posing as freedmen. However, these stories often ended with betrayal. A neighbor might recognize the boy. A former slave could be tempted by the reward. Once returned, punishment was swift and public. Trust was fragile in the world of Roman slavery. Enslaved children were sometimes encouraged to report on others to earn favor. A boy who overheard escape plans might speak up to protect himself. This system of betrayal served Roman interests. Fear of others, fellow slaves, older attendants, even siblings, undermined solidarity. Each slave was a potential informer. Masters used this fear to maintain control. Some had boys punished, not only for running, but for appearing to consider it. Accusation alone could result in confinement or beating. In one recorded case, a slave boy was punished after another claimed he had looked too long at the courtyard gate. The system rewarded suspicion. It did not require proof. Children caught aiding a fugitive faced the same punishments as those who fled. Solidarity among slaves was discouraged through cruelty. A boy who helped another hide might be flogged or sold. Selling was its own punishment, separation from all familiar places, faces, and routines. It erased the few ties that made the condition endurable. Flight also carried economic consequences. A runaway boy cost his owner time, money, and status. If not recovered quickly, he might be replaced. That cost could be deducted from a steward's allowance. Sometimes, blame was placed on other slaves, who were punished collectively. The actions of one could provoke discipline for many. Despite the dangers, the desire to escape persisted. Some boys tried more than once. Others never tried at all. Not out of submission, but calculation. They weighed pain against the odds. Many chose silence, labor, and survival. But the idea of escape never vanished. It lingered as a flicker in the mind when a gate was left open or a guard looked away. Roman art and literature rarely depicted fugitive children. Their stories were not celebrated. They were not rescued. They were not remembered. To Roman authors, a boy who ran was a failed object, a tool that disobeyed. But in fragments of graffiti, legal scrolls, and household records, their presence remains. Lost, returned, punished, forgotten. For the enslaved boy, escape was not just a run toward freedom. It was a break from identity, a gamble against erasure, and often a final act of defiance. In a world that made him invisible, the runaway became painfully visible, and that visibility carried a price. Slave schools and training for obedience. Not all enslaved boys in Rome learned their roles through labor alone. In larger households, temples, and imperial estates, there existed a form of structured instruction. Slave schools, where boys were trained not to grow, but to conform. These environments were designed not to educate in the traditional sense, but to mold the mind and body for obedience. The goal was not curiosity or advancement, but predictability. These training schools were not separate institutions, like the public schools attended by free Roman children. Instead, they existed within villas, palaces, and workshops. The ergastulum, a kind of slave barracks, sometimes doubled as a training site, especially for rural slaves. In urban settings, larger homes employed overseers or senior slaves who were tasked with preparing new arrivals for service. The term disciplinarium was occasionally used to describe places where correction and instruction were combined. Enslaved boys were typically introduced to these routines shortly after purchase. Some were as young as 6 or 7. Their training began with posture, speech, and gesture. They were taught how to carry trays, sweep in silence, stand with eyes lowered, and respond to commands immediately. They learned to fold garments in exact ways, prepare meals without question, and navigate a household without being noticed. Precision and invisibility were both required. Obedience was taught through repetition. A boy might spend hours practicing how to enter a room without creaking a hinge, how to bow at the right angle, or how to light an oil lamp without spilling wax. These were not trivial tasks. They were expected with exactness. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, often with physical punishment. A slap for hesitation, a blow for disobedience. Pain was not reserved for failure. It was embedded into the process of learning itself. The instructors were usually senior slaves, men or women who had survived long enough to rise in rank. They were not kind, but they were efficient. Their authority came from experience, not freedom. They taught survival as much as service. Some issued commands with barked orders. Others taught through silence, forcing boys to observe and imitate. There was no room for self-expression. Emotion was discouraged. A boy who smiled at the wrong moment, who looked too long at a master's face, could be punished. Alongside tasks, these boys learned hierarchy. They were taught the names and ranks of everyone in the household. They memorized titles, duties, and expectations. They learned which rooms they could not enter and which people they must never address. In religious households, temple slaves were taught rituals, chants, and sacred postures. In business homes, they might be taught how to handle ledgers or run errands with messages they could not read. Some boys learned to read simple scripts, especially if they were being prepared as clerks or messengers. But literacy was functional. It served the master, not the child. Any skill a boy acquired increased his value, but not his autonomy. He remained an object of utility. Even those chosen for higher household roles, such as chamber attendants or personal valets, understood that the training was not for their sake. The psychological effect of such training was lasting. Many boys emerged from these schools with stiff manners and fearful silences. Their movements were careful, almost ritualized. They responded automatically to authority, flinched at loud voices, and avoided direct speech. Their lives were shaped around anticipation, anticipating commands, moods, punishments. The training did not teach them how to be men. It taught them how not to offend the men who owned them. Sleep, meals, and rest were part of the routine but strictly controlled. A boy might sleep in a shared room with straw mats, eat after others had finished, and rise before dawn. His schedule belonged to the household. Even hygiene was regulated. Baths were taken under supervision, sometimes cold and rushed. A clean appearance was required, but comfort was irrelevant. These slave schools did not promise graduation or reward. There were no ceremonies, no recognition of skill. Success was measured only by silence, smooth service, and the absence of correction. A well-trained boy did not stand out. He disappeared into function. And if he failed, if he dropped a dish, spoke too loudly, or disobeyed, his punishment was not seen as cruel, but necessary. Sold for loyalty, slaves as imperial gifts and honors. In the upper tiers of Roman power, slavery took on a symbolic as well as practical function. Among generals, senators, and emperors, the act of gifting an enslaved boy was not only a gesture of wealth, it was a political message. Slaves could be bought, sold, or inherited, but the ones given as honors carried an extra weight. Their presence marked allegiance. Their service was a currency of favor. Boys were chosen for these exchanges based not only on skill, but on appearance, temperament, and perceived loyalty. A well-trained child, obedient and fluent in Greek, might be sent from one elite household to another as part of a diplomatic gesture. Some were presented following military victories, others were offered during senatorial banquets or religious festivals. The boy himself had no say. He was wrapped, delivered, and displayed no different from a jeweled cup or ceremonial dagger. In the imperial court, this practice became especially visible. Emperors like Augustus and Nero were known to distribute enslaved youths to supporters, clients, and foreign envoys. These gifts often included detailed descriptions of the child's abilities, background, and training. A boy's value was enhanced by his silence, his beauty, or his proficiency in music or rhetoric. When gifted, he was expected to perform either by reciting poetry, serving wine, or standing quietly at his new master's side. For the recipient, the boy was both servant and symbol. Accepting such a gift affirmed loyalty to the giver. Refusing it could be interpreted as offense or defiance. The boy became part of a transaction that exceeded his own body. He represented trust, dependence, and mutual understanding between powerful men. But while the masters exchanged approval, the boy's reality was unaltered. He had simply changed hands. In some cases, imperial households would send enslaved boys to the families of generals or regional governors as marks of gratitude or leverage. A well-placed boy could serve as both helper and informant. Letters from the reign of Tiberius mention attendants who relayed information from private rooms back to imperial advisors. Their ears were as important as their hands. To ensure loyalty, some were branded discreetly, marked on the shoulder or thigh with imperial symbols. Others were registered in household inventories alongside gold, silver, and livestock. Their movements were tracked. Their behavior was watched. If they were caught stealing, speaking out of turn, or attempting escape, the punishment reflected not only personal failure, but a perceived insult to the patron who had gifted them. Within this system, boys were taught to be grateful. Training often included stories about how the emperor or noble benefactor had chosen them specially. They were reminded that their status, while still enslaved, was elevated. They might sleep indoors, wear clean tunics, or serve food at higher tables. But this apparent privilege only deepened the control. A boy who lost favor could be demoted, beaten, or sold into a harsher setting. The message was clear. Loyalty was not just expected. It was mandatory for survival. Not all boys given as gifts were anonymous. Some were publicly named in dedications or household records. A boy given by the emperor might carry a new name reflecting the donor's title, such as Augustalis or Neronianus. This rebranding severed ties to previous identity and reinforced ownership. His name became a reminder of who had given him and to whom he now belonged. In the provinces, local elites sometimes copied this model. A wealthy landowner might gift a trained slave boy to a visiting magistrate, temple, or military commander. Such gestures reinforced networks of influence. The boy was rarely kept for his own qualities alone. His presence served the bond between two households, two cities, or two factions of power. For enslaved boys, being given as a gift brought unpredictable outcomes. Some entered refined homes with better food or lighter duties, while others faced harsher, more dangerous environments. Past obedience offered no protection. Value was determined by the shifting needs, ambitions, and tempers of powerful men. In Rome, a boy could be sold not only in markets, but through letters, conversations, and gestures of loyalty. His body forged alliances, his silence preserved them, and his obedience secured a place he could never claim. Clothing, silence, and the erasure of identity. In Roman society, clothing served as more than utility or ornamentation. It defined rank, status, origin, and role. For enslaved boys, it was never a matter of choice. Their garments were not selected for comfort or self-expression, but to reinforce their status as property. Clothing became a visual marker of control, meant to distinguish them from freeborn youth and erase individuality. Most enslaved boys wore tunics, simple garments made from coarse wool or linen. These tunics were usually undyed, plain, and short, exposing limbs to make physical labor easier and punishment more immediate. The tunic did not merely suggest low status. It publicly broadcasted it. A boy wearing such a garment could not be mistaken for anything other than a slave. Footwear, if provided, served function over care. In rural areas, boys often went barefoot, regardless of terrain or season. In urban settings, sandals might be issued, but only to speed up tasks. They were not a sign of consideration. Torn clothing was minimally repaired, and garments were rarely replaced as the child grew. The clothing stayed the same. The boy adapted to fit it. In elite households, boys chosen to serve guests or appear in public were sometimes dressed more carefully. These enhancements, however, were not intended for the child's benefit. They were displays of the master's wealth and order. A slave boy might wear a cleaner tunic or a garment with colored trim during a banquet, but it was removed afterward, washed, and reused by others. His appearance belonged to his role, not to himself. Silence operated alongside clothing as a form of discipline. Enslaved boys were expected to speak only when addressed. Laughter, questions, or even audible footsteps could be met with correction. In elite homes, silence was praised only when it reflected obedience. Noise was treated as disruption. Crying, even in distress, risked punishment. In this way, silence functioned as a second uniform, one that made the boy present but invisible. Renaming often marked the beginning of a boy's erasure. Children taken from distant provinces were stripped of their birth names and given new ones by their owners. These might reflect traits Felix for lucky, Sylvanus for rural origins, or be completely arbitrary. Some were assigned numbers or diminutives, reducing them to functions rather than people. The name served as a label, not a connection to lineage. It reminded the child daily that he did not belong to himself. This process deepened over time. A boy who served well might be praised, but the recognition was impersonal. He was a good boy, a quick runner, a silent helper, never a person with a story or a voice. He learned to avoid asserting himself, to suppress opinions, and to carry out commands without question. Over the years, this erasure of expression reshaped his view of self. He was trained not only in labor, but in vanishing. Some Roman thinkers noted the consequences. Seneca, writing in his letters, advised moderation in the treatment of slaves not because of sympathy, but because excessive cruelty led to instability. Yet even he did not question the institution itself. Silence from the enslaved was seen as a desirable trait, not as the result of oppression. A quiet, obedient boy was considered a reflection of household order. His suffering was normalized, unnoticed, and unrecorded. In Roman mosaics and artwork, enslaved children sometimes appear in the margins. Small figures with jugs or towels, dressed in short tunics, eyes cast downward. They are never named. They appear in scenes of wealth and leisure, but never as participants. They function as background present, but not acknowledged. Their role was to serve the narrative of Roman luxury, not to have one of their own. Burial practices echoed this erasure. Freeborn children were often commemorated with stones, inscriptions, and epitaphs. Enslaved boys, if buried by owners, rarely received markers. If buried by other slaves, it was done quietly, with little ceremony. Even in death, recognition remained out of reach. Their lives ended much as they were lived unacknowledged. Clothing, silence, and invisibility reshaped the enslaved child into something functional, not personal. Each tunic, each quiet moment, erased identity and reinforced control. In a society that prized status and voice, he was trained to vanish visible but unnoticed, obedient but unheard, remembered only through the power of those who owned him. Death without mourning. What happened to aging boy slaves? In Roman households, the enslaved boy was a tool of labor, obedience, and display. His role was defined by youth, by small hands, soft voices, and pliable behavior. But time was not on his side. The body that once fetched wine, trimmed lamps, or stood silently beside a guest did not remain unchanged. The question of what happened when these boys aged out of their usefulness was not answered with care. It was answered with silence, sale, or disposal. There was no set age at which a boy ceased to be considered a boy. In Roman records, terms like puer and adolescens, youth, blurred the lines. What mattered was utility. As soon as a child became less marketable, less aesthetically pleasing, or less compliant, his value declined. This could happen at 12 or at 15. The transition was not marked by ceremony. It was marked by absence. One day, he was there. Then, he wasn't. Some boys, as they grew, were retrained. If physically strong, they might be reassigned to manual labor, farm work, stable duty, or construction. Others, especially those who had learned household routines, might become assistant stewards or junior overseers. These roles offered no protection. Authority did not mean freedom. It only meant more responsibility under the same threat of punishment. Boys considered less useful were often sold. Sales records sometimes list house-born boys nearing maturity at reduced prices. These boys were not prized. Their growing bodies no longer fit the delicate mold Roman elites associated with ideal domestic servants. Buyers might be plantation owners, seeking field laborers, or traders looking to resell. The child's fate depended on market demand, not his history or service. In some cases, older boys who had been kept for personal use, especially for private companionship, were discarded without mention. Their presence had been conditional. Once no longer desired, they could be sold discreetly or sent away to rural holdings. There, life grew harsher. Food was rougher. Work was constant. Discipline, less restrained. For many, this was where their lives ended not through execution, but through injury, exposure, or exhaustion. When such deaths occurred, they were rarely recorded. The enslaved did not receive the mourning rites offered to citizens. No public notice was posted. No lamentation was expected. If the body was recovered, it might be burned or buried in an unmarked grave. Sometimes, other slaves performed the burial quietly at the edge of a field. Other times, there was no burial at all, only abandonment. Few tombstones mention enslaved boys. Those that do are exceptions, usually erected by fellow slaves, occasionally by masters seeking to display their benevolence. One surviving inscription from the 2nd century CE refers to a boy named Tryphon, aged around 12, diligent in his tasks and obedient to the end. The stone was small, the words few. There is no mention of cause, only of silence. Roman moralists did not discuss the fate of aging boy slaves. Their writings focused on household order, discipline, and virtue, not on the disposal of human tools. When death came, it was treated like the breaking of an object. Useful once, replaced now. A lost investment, not a lost life. Some boys, when close to death, were isolated. Infections, injuries, or visible illnesses could unsettle a household. To preserve appearance and hygiene, sick boys might be removed from view. Others were abandoned if care became too inconvenient. A child who could no longer serve often found no one willing to speak for him. He faded, unnoticed. There are records of enslaved people begging for burial for their dead companions. In one case, an older slave petitioned a magistrate to allow burial for a boy who had died of exposure. The request was granted, but only because the boy had once served in a wealthy household. Compassion came second to reputation. For the boy who aged without notice, whose usefulness declined in silence, there was no ceremony, no final words, no carved name. His life had been measured in tasks completed and commands obeyed. His end was measured in how quietly he disappeared. In the Roman system, the enslaved boy's value was inseparable from his youth. When that youth faded, so did attention. He was not mourned, he was not remembered. He was replaced, echoes of a forgotten childhood. In Roman society, the childhood of an enslaved boy left few traces. His name changed. His speech was silenced. His body obeyed. Unlike freeborn children, whose memories could be preserved in letters, portraits, or tombstones, the enslaved child vanished even as he lived. What remained were tasks completed, punishments endured, and roles performed. And when he disappeared through death, sale, or erasure, so did the record of his existence. The Roman world did not consider enslaved childhood as a distinct category of concern. A boy could be born into slavery or captured at 5 years old and still be subject to the same rules as an adult slave. The law recognized his master's right to punish, relocate, sell, or use him without restriction. Education, when offered, served the household, not the boy. Training in reading, writing, or etiquette existed not to empower, but to enhance utility. The cleverer the child, the more refined his service. A literate boy might manage correspondence or entertain a guest. But even this skill was transactional. His knowledge belonged to the master. His voice was trained not for self-expression, but for obedience. Some enslaved boys were remembered in passing, appearing in the margins of Roman literature as humorous companions, tragic victims, or symbols of luxury. Poets described them as nimble attendants or weeping servants. Philosophers used them as examples in moral arguments. But these depictions were not portraits. They were metaphors. The boy himself, the real child, remained unnamed, unseen. Even in archaeology, his presence is faint. A child's shoe found near a villa. A set of small shackles unearthed from a rural estate. Graffiti scratched low on a wall. These are the clues left behind. No diary, no statue, no song sung in his voice. The enslaved boy was part of the architecture, part of the service, part of the silence. In mosaics, enslaved children appear at the edge of scenes, carrying trays, adjusting sandals, leading animals. Their heads are bowed, their expressions neutral. In some, they are so small and faceless they blend into the pattern. These images were not meant to celebrate them. They function like furniture indicators of wealth, not of life. The absence of memory was deliberate. A child who lived in service was expected to leave no personal legacy. He had no lineage to pass down, no possessions to bequeath. His existence, defined by others, was not meant to outlast his function. When he died, no biographer recorded his habits. No monument bore his face. His name, if known, was likely shared by dozens of others. Felix, Dama, Cyrus, common labels for uncommon losses. Some enslaved boys might have held memories of their own families, especially those taken from distant provinces. A scent, a word, a gesture might linger in the mind long after their language was lost. But there was no space to speak of home. Such memories became internal artifacts preserved privately, expressed only in dreams or fleeting tears. Those who survived into adulthood often carried those unspoken childhoods with them. A former boy slave, now a laborer or assistant, might walk the same paths where he once stood silently beside a master. He might recall the moment his name was taken or the first time he was struck. But these recollections had no official place. The system did not archive their pain. It continued, indifferent. There is no collective record of enslaved boyhood in Rome. There is no archive of stories told from their perspective. What survives are laws that strip them of autonomy, artworks that reduce them to symbols, and fragments of burial inscriptions that reveal only a few letters and ages. These fragments are not enough to restore their lives, but they are enough to acknowledge the scale of their disappearance. Echoes may be the wrong word. An echo implies an original voice. For many of these children, there was never a first telling, only the silence imposed from the beginning. What remains are traces, worn steps, faded names, bones without markers. In every Roman household that claimed elegance or order, there was once a boy whose hands lit the lamp or folded the cloth. He was not thanked, he was not remembered, but he was there,